All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're going deep, real deep, into a mystery that's as cold as a Washington winter.
And twice as puzzling.
The unsolved tube sock killings in Mineral, Washington. 1985, pile of police reports, news articles, even unsolved mysteries.
Oh, wow. Unsolved mysteries. This is serious stuff.
Absolutely. Two couples, a missing father, a 2-year-old alone outside a Kmart.
Alone, like completely by herself.
You got it. Remote campsites, snowy forests, and one creepy clue that connects it all.
Okay, you gotta tell me, what's the clue?
Tube socks, found tied around the victims' necks.
What? Seriously? Tube socks?
Yeah, it's a strange one. And that's what makes this case so perplexing. Each piece seems to create more questions than answers.
It's like a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing.
100%. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Harkins and Cooper, August 1985.
Our first couple.
Exactly. They head off camping and then poof, gone.
Vanished. Just like that.
Well, Harkins was found in his sleeping bag, which is already pretty eerie.
Someone came into their tent while they were sleeping.
Exactly. And then there's the dog.
Oh no, don't tell me the dog.
Shot dead right there at the campsite.
So the killer felt threatened by the dog? Or maybe just cruel?
Right. Was it a witness they needed to silence? Or just a sick act?
Hard to say. It definitely makes you think about what kind of person we're dealing with here.
No kidding. And then, of course, there's Cooper.
Completely missing.
At first, yeah. Months later, her skull turns up.
Oh, wow. And then the rest of her?
Found nearby. And, of course, the tube sock.
The tube socks. So bizarre. What was the purpose? Why a tube sock?
Was it symbolic? Functional? Was it just random?
I actually went back and looked the autopsy reports for this. They are, vague, to say the least.
Vague. How so?
Well, some just say homicidal violence. Others mention a gunshot wound to the abdomen.
So we don't even know for sure how she died.
Not definitively. It makes you think about the forensic limitations back then, you know?
In 85.
Yeah. Imagine if they had today's DNA analysis. It was in its infancy back then. They had to work with a fraction of the pieces we have today.
Right. And the locations, those remote areas.
Rain, snow, all erasing potential clues.
Yeah, the elements definitely didn't make things easy.
Not at all.
Okay, so one couple down. A missing woman. Tons of unanswered questions. Then, just when you think it can't get weirder, the Reimer family disappears.
Another couple.
A young couple, yeah, and their 2-year-old daughter.
Out in the middle of nowhere.
Out looking for a Christmas tree, and then nothing. Gone.
But what about the little girl? 2 years old, you said.
Little Crystal. Found wandering, alone, outside a Kmart, miles from where her parents vanished.
That's heartbreaking. What happened to them?
That's the million-dollar question. And when asked about her mom, all Crystal could say was, "Mommy was in the trees."
Oh my God. Chillin'. That image of that little girl lost and alone saying that, it just sends shivers down my spine.
Right. And then months later, they find Diana Robertson's body.
Another body.
Remote area. Just like Cooper. And you guessed it, another tube sock.
Another one. So we have a connection. This can't be a coincidence.
Right. Then there's Reimer's truck, found near Robertson's body, note inside. "I love you, Diana."
Genuine message or a red herring? Did he write it?
We don't even know if it was his handwriting. Plus, there were blood stains in the truck. Whose blood?
So many questions. Reimer's, Robertson's, someone else's entirely.
Initially, they thought Reimer was the killer.
Made sense.
Right. Domestic assault charges in his past.
But then no motive for the other couple. And a toddler abandoned miles away.
It just didn't add up.
So maybe he was a victim too, taken by the same person.
And for years, the case just sat there, cold, until 2011.
2011, what happened?
They found Reimer's skull, not far from where they found Robertson's body.
Oh, wait, if he was a victim too, that means there's someone else out there. Someone who killed them both.
Exactly. And we still don't know for sure how he died or if he was involved in Robertson's death at all.
So many questions. Who was this tube sock killer? Were they responsible for all the deaths? Or are we dealing with two different killers with a creepy shared detail?
It's a head scratcher, that's for sure. And then we have to ask ourselves, why tube socks?
Out of all of the things, so ordinary, was it just what was handy?
Maybe. Or maybe it was about sending a message. Think about it. In 1985, a tube sock, super common.
I see what you're saying. It's like saying, I'm just like you. I could be anyone.
Right. It makes it even more terrifying because it could have been anyone. Your neighbor, the mailman, the person in line behind you at the grocery store.
Ugh, that's creepy. But we need to try and understand their motive. Was it power, rage, or something else altogether?
We have a lot to unpack here, but that's why we're here. To delve into the details, connect those dots, and maybe, just maybe, shed some light on this dark mystery.
And we need to remember, these were real people. People with families and lives who were tragically cut short.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget that human cost. So as we go deeper into the tube sock killings, let's try to balance our thirst for the truth with a sense of empathy for the victims and their loved ones.
Now, looking at the timeline again, Harkins and Cooper in August, then Robertson and Reimer in December, that 4-month gap, was that intentional?
Like a cooling off period.
Exactly. Or just a coincidence?
It's a good question. Could the killer have been laying low, waiting to strike again? Or were these isolated incidents that just happened to share that one disturbing detail?
And if it was a cooling off period, what was the killer doing during those months? Living a normal life, planning their next move.
The thought is just, wow, unsettling.
It is.
All right, so we've got two sets of murders, a missing dad, a toddler who might be the only witness, and those haunting tube socks. Where do we even begin to unravel this?
Sometimes the key to a puzzle is understanding the mind of the one who created it. Why these victims? Why those locations? Why tube socks? If we can answer those questions, maybe we can crack this thing wide open.
So let's put on our detective hats for a second. What would you focus on if you were investigating this case? What details would keep you up at night?
The locations, definitely.
Right.
Remote campsites, logging roads, places where you could easily disappear. Did the killer know those areas well?
Like they worked in the woods or something? A park ranger, maybe?
Yeah, someone who could blend in, vanish like a ghost.
Or maybe they chose those isolated spots because they were isolated, you know?
You're right. To avoid detection doesn't have to be someone local.
Exactly. It could be someone passing through, someone who deliberately targeted those spots because they knew they wouldn't be disturbed.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity. It makes it that much harder to track them down.
Right. But then how would they find those specific locations if they weren't familiar with the area? Did they do research? Was there something specific that drew them to those spots?
Very good questions. The choice of location is almost never random. There's usually a reason, a connection that draws a killer to a specific place.
Okay, so we're looking for someone who either knows the area very well or someone who carefully selected these locations for a specific purpose. But what about that 4-month gap between the murders? Do you think it was significant?
The timing is important, that's for sure. Was it a cooling off period? Did something in the killer's life trigger them to strike again?
Or was it just a coincidence?
That's always a possibility. But for the sake of argument, let's imagine it was a cooling off period. What was the killer doing during those 4 months?
Right. Were they laying low, planning their next move, choosing their next victims?
It's chilling to think about, but we need to consider all the possibilities. We're trying to understand someone who can switch on and off like that, blending into society 1 minute, committing horrible acts the next.
And don't forget, these crimes happened in the 80s, long before social media and all the surveillance we have today. Back then, it was much easier to vanish without a trace.
Oh, absolutely. It was a different world. It makes this investigation even more challenging.
You're telling me it's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture to guide you.
But even the most complex puzzles can be solved. Patience, persistence, and a little bit of outside-the-box thinking.
That's what we're doing here today, taking those pieces, examining them, looking for those connections, trying to make sense of it all.
And in doing so, maybe we can shed a little light on this darkness, honor the victims, and hopefully bring some peace to those who've been searching for answers for so long.
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder if that detail, the dog being shot, was just random, or if it tells us something important about the killer.
Yeah, like if they saw the dog as a threat, maybe. A witness they had to eliminate.
Exactly. Or maybe it was just a cruel act, adding to the horror of it all. It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely makes you think.
And then we have that whole mystery surrounding Cooper's cause of death. Remember, some reports just say homicidal violence, while others mention a gunshot wound. It's strange. Yeah, it is. It's almost as if they were initially sure she was murdered, but couldn't pinpoint how, and then later, the gunshot detail emerges. It's perplexing.
Maybe the forensic technology back then just wasn't advanced enough.
That's possible. I mean, think about it. 1985, no DNA testing like we have today, no fancy imaging techniques. Even determining something as basic as cause of death could have been so much harder back then.
Well, right. It's a good reminder that we're always limited by the technology of the time, even when it comes to solving crimes.
For sure.
Okay, so let's try to piece this together. We have one couple on a camping trip, brutally murdered, their dog killed, and conflicting information about how the woman died. Then we have the Reimers searching for a Christmas tree, mom found dead with a tube sock, dad missing, and their toddler abandoned. Does this sound like the work of one person to you?
It's tempting to connect the dots, isn't it? Especially with the tube socks. But we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions.
Right, but we can't ignore the possible connections either. It's not every day you find two seemingly unrelated cases with such a specific and strange detail in common.
Yeah, that's true. So let's look at the note found in Reimer's truck, the I love you, Diana note. Could it have been genuine, a last message before something terrible happened, or was it staged to mislead the investigation?
And don't forget those blood stains they found in the truck. Whose blood was it? Was Reimer injured? Was there a struggle? Did someone else bleed in that truck?
Those bloodstains are a big deal. If we could link them to Reimer, to Robertson, or even to some unknown person, it could completely change our understanding of what happened. Imagine if that blood belonged to someone totally unconnected to this case. It would blow the whole thing wide open.
It's like every time we think we're getting closer to solving this puzzle, another piece pops out of place. And then there's the biggest question of all. Why tube socks? Of all the possible weapons, why choose something so ordinary?
Well, sometimes a weapon, especially in cases like this, can offer clues about the killer's psychology. Was it about accessibility? Was a tube sock just the most convenient thing they could find? Or was there a deeper meaning behind it? Something symbolic?
You know what? I was thinking the same thing. Maybe the ordinariness of the tube sock was part of the message. Like the killer was trying to say, look, I could be anyone. I could be your neighbor, the person you see at the grocery store.
Whoa. That's a disturbing thought, but it makes sense. It's not like they use some elaborate, one-of-a-kind weapon. It's something everyone has, and that makes it even scarier.
Exactly. And it really makes you think about their motive. What was driving them? Power, control, or something else entirely? I mean, we have two couples, seemingly random, and then a family. Was there a type, a pattern to their victims?
It's not your typical serial killer profile, that's for sure. But there has to be some reason they chose these people.
Right. It couldn't have been completely random. Were they just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something specific about them that drew the killer's attention?
Don't forget that for the longest time, everyone was focused on Reimer as the potential killer.
Yeah, with his history of domestic assault charges and everything.
Right, but then his skull is found and suddenly he's a victim too, and that changes everything.
Absolutely. If he was murdered, it means someone else was out there. Someone who was strong enough to overpower him. Someone who was able to get rid of his body and keep it hidden for years. That's a whole different kind of scary.
That's the part that gets to me too. If Reimer was a victim, how did the killer manage to pull that off? With his wife and child right there. Was Diana Robertson already dead? How did they keep a 2-year-old quiet?
That's a huge question. It means we're dealing with someone who's not only capable of violence, but also incredibly cunning and resourceful.
It's truly disturbing, and it makes you wonder if this was their first crime, or if there are other victims out there, other families who simply vanish without a trace.
And what about little Crystal? She was so young. Do you think she remembers what happened that night? Or did she repress the memories?
That poor child. The trauma must have been unimaginable. And at 2 years old, her ability to understand and articulate what she saw would have been limited. But it's possible that she holds key details hidden away somewhere in her mind that could help solve this case.
It's a heartbreaking thought. But you're right, it's a possibility.
It is.
It's a lot to process, but through all of this, it's important to remember that these were real people, families who were torn apart by these horrific acts.
You're right, we can't get lost in the theories and speculation. These were individuals with lives, with loved ones, with dreams, and their stories deserve to be told.
Okay, I'm ready to dig a little deeper. We talked about the victims, the timeline, the possible profile of the killer. Let's go back to those locations. Remote campsites, logging roads. Do you think the killer was someone who knew those areas really well? Maybe someone who worked in the woods?
That's definitely a solid theory. Someone who works in forestry, a hunter, even a park ranger. They would know the terrain, know how to move around without being seen.
And their presence in those areas wouldn't be suspicious.
Exactly. But we can't rule out the possibility that the killer was from somewhere else. Someone who deliberately chose those spots because they were so isolated.
True. It could have been someone just passing through, someone who targeted those areas specifically to avoid being detected.
And think about it, if they weren't local, it makes their movements so much harder to track. They could strike and disappear without a trace.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of complexity to an already baffling case. But then how would they even find those spots if they weren't familiar with the area? Did they do research? Was there something specific that drew them there?
You've got a point. The choice of location is rarely random, especially when we're talking about multiple victims. There's usually a reason, some connection that pulls a killer to that specific place.
Okay, so we're looking for someone who either knows the area like the back of their hand or someone who very carefully selected these locations for a specific reason. But what about that 4-month gap between the murders? Do you think it means anything?
I think the timing is definitely something we need to look at more closely. Was it a cooling off period? Did something happen in the killer's life during those months that made them snap?
Or maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe there's no connection at all and we're trying to find a pattern where there isn't one.
It's possible, but we can't just ignore the timing. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that it was a cooling off period. What do you think the killer was doing during those 4 months?
Hmm. Were they laying low, trying to avoid being caught? Or were they planning their next move, picking their next victims?
It's a scary thought, I know. But we have to consider all the possibilities. We're trying to understand the mind of someone who can go from blending in with society to committing these horrific acts.
And remember, this was the 80s. No social media, no widespread surveillance. It would have been much easier to disappear back then.
You're absolutely right. It was a different world. And that makes this investigation even more difficult.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces are missing and you don't even have the box to look at.
But even the most complex puzzles can be solved. It just takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to think outside the box.
And that's what we're doing here today. Examining each piece, looking for connections, and trying to make sense of it all.
Hopefully, in doing so, we can shed some light on this mystery, honor the victims, and maybe, just maybe, bring some peace to the people who've been looking for answers for so long.
We're back, ready to dig into those investigations. You mentioned they were full of twists and turns, shocking revelations even. What can you tell us?
So with Harkins and Cooper, investigators actually looked into a possible connection to another murder.
Another murder.
Yeah, the Smith and Levine murders, another couple killed earlier that same year. Small town, short time frame. It's natural to look for links.
Right, especially when you're dealing with something this unusual.
Uh-huh.
But did they ever find any concrete evidence to connect those cases?
Not really. Despite some similarities, both couples both found murdered. Nothing directly linked the two cases. And unfortunately, the Smith and Levine murders are still unsolved.
So are we talking two separate killers operating in the same area, both targeting couples?
Yeah.
Or maybe one killer who, changed their methods over time?
It's possible, like having two puzzle boxes, each with its own pieces, but both hinting at a bigger picture, something we can't quite grasp.
I like that analogy. Okay, so no solid link to the Smith and Levine case.
Oh.
What about the Reimers? We talked about how the suspicion initially fell on Reimer, especially with his history of domestic violence.
Right, but then remember they found his skull years later, and that completely changed things.
Shifted the focus from Reimer the killer to Reimer the possible victim.
Exactly, but it also made the investigation even more complicated.
Because now they had to figure out who killed Diana Robertson and who killed Reimer, and if those two murders were even connected.
It added a whole other layer of questions. And think about it, they found Reimer's skull years after the initial investigation. That means going back to a decades-old crime scene, trying to find new evidence in an area that had been exposed to the elements, maybe even tampered with over time.
That must have been incredibly challenging. It really speaks to the dedication of those cold case investigators, the fact that they're willing to go back and re-examine every detail, even years later.
It really does. And sometimes it's those little details, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, that end up being the key to the whole thing.
Makes you wonder what else they might have missed. So aside from the limited technology back then, what were some of the other challenges investigators faced trying to solve these cases?
Well, for one, the locations themselves were a huge obstacle. We're talking about campsites, logging roads, not exactly easy places to secure and investigate.
Right. Preserving evidence, even just getting to those locations, must have been a logistical nightmare.
It was. And every day that passes, the chances of finding undisturbed evidence decrease. Weather, animals, even just people hiking through the area, it all adds to the complexity.
Not to mention time itself. Witnesses' memories fade, details get lost, people move away, or worse.
Exactly. It's like trying to piece together a broken mirror, knowing that some of the shards will always be missing.
So with all those challenges, is there any hope of ever solving these cases?
Well, you know what they say about cold cases? They may go cold, but they never truly die.
There's always a chance.
Always. Technology is constantly evolving. DNA analysis is getting more sophisticated all the time. A sample that was inconclusive years ago might give us a match today. Facial reconstruction can help put a name to unidentified remains. And sometimes, all it takes is one new witness, someone who was too afraid to speak before, or who suddenly remembers something crucial.
It's like a race against time, gathering those missing pieces before they're lost forever. But even if we never find the killer, I think it's important to keep revisiting these cases, analyzing the evidence, keeping the victims' stories alive.
I agree. These were real people with families and friends, lives that were cut short. And by remembering them, we honor their memory and acknowledge the impact these crimes had.
It's a reminder that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, and that even when it feels like all hope is lost, the search for the truth must continue. So as we close out our deep dive into the tube sock killings, let's take a moment to remember those victims. Stephen Harkins, Ruth Cooper, Mike Reimer, Diana Robertson, and Little Crystal, who I truly hope has found some peace and healing in her life.
Absolutely. Their stories are a powerful reminder that life is precious and that violence has lasting consequences. And they encourage us to never stop seeking answers, never give up hope, even when a case seems impossible to solve.
We may never know for sure who committed these crimes or why, but one thing is certain: the mystery of the tube sock killings continues to fascinate and haunt us. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human need for truth and justice never fades.
And if anyone out there has any information about these cases, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact the authorities. Even the smallest detail could be the missing piece that brings closure to these families and helps bring the person responsible to justice.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the most baffling true crime mysteries out there. Stay curious, keep those minds sharp, and never stop searching for the truth, no matter how elusive it may seem.